From a legal perspective, this story is devastating. Coercive control, public humiliation, financial abuse, and a husband who believed wealth could bury the truth. But one voice memo, one synchronized iPad, and one fearless strategy changed everything. What began as a marriage built on manipulation became a courtroom reckoning that exposed motive, pattern, and cruelty with surgical precision and left a nation stunned.
In front of his mistress, a billionaire husband forced his wife to kneel on the cold marble floor of their home. She was 8 months pregnant. He demanded an apology. What he did not know was that her phone was recording his every word. 47 days later, that audio played in a courtroom. 12 people listened to it live. The judge's final order left the entire country in shock. This is not just a story of a broken heart. It is the story of a woman who lost it all, then rose up to destroy the man who tried to ruin her. When this story ends, you will have heard the most satisfying justice ever served. You will not want to miss a moment. I can promise that what unfolds in that courtroom will stay with you forever. If you find this story compelling, please subscribe and turn on your notifications. Tell me what you think in the comments. Please share this with anyone who needs to see justice. And now, the story begins. His command sliced through the quiet room. Get on your knees. Charlotte Weston froze in the massive entryway of her Manhattan apartment. Her husband's voice was like ice, a kind of deep freeze that burns the skin and leaves a permanent mark. She was 8 months along in her pregnancy. For weeks, her ankles had been painfully swollen. A constant, deep ache shot through her lower back each time she took a breath. The baby had been kicking all day long, seeming upset and anxious, as if it sensed a terrible event was about to happen. The foyer was a stunning space. The ceiling soared 20 feet above polished Italian marble floors. The chandelier itself was more valuable than most family homes. Charlotte had designed the entire penthouse herself, picking out every single detail. But at that moment, it felt like a gilded cage. Graham Holt stood only 6 feet away from her. His jaw was set in a hard line. His eyes were empty and cold. Behind him, Sienna Cross was relaxing on an ivory sofa. It was the same one Charlotte had picked out 3 years ago during their honeymoon in Paris. She was the woman Charlotte had been suspicious of for months. The signs had all been there. There were the late nights that became early mornings. He always found a reason to cancel their anniversary dinners. He made sure his phone was always face down. She would sometimes notice a strange perfume on his shirts. But having a suspicion is a world away from knowing the truth. That very morning, she had found the confirmation she needed. There were hundreds, possibly thousands, of text messages that went back for years. I told you, get on your knees. Graham's voice was sharper this time, the powerful tone he used to close major business deals. It was a voice that intimidated even the strongest men. Charlotte could barely manage a whisper. Graham, please, let's not do this in front of her. Can we please discuss this alone? There is nothing left to talk about. He stepped closer to her. She could smell the cologne he was wearing. It was Armani Code, the exact same one she had bought him for their 3rd anniversary. Now the scent just made her stomach turn. You called Sienna a liar. You humiliated her at a business lunch today, in front of my whole world. I did not humiliate anybody. Charlotte's hands instinctively went to her pregnant stomach in a protective motion. I only asked her to please not touch my husband. I asked her to show our marriage a little respect. Sienna laughed from her seat on the sofa. The sound was high and sharp, like a crystal glass breaking on the marble floor. You see, Graham, Sienna's voice was like sweet poison. I told you she was a jealous person. I had a feeling she would make a big scene. This is just so pathetic. A pregnant wife throwing around these crazy accusations. It is so embarrassing. Charlotte felt like she could not breathe. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could hear it in her ears. This cannot be happening. This is not real. She was carrying his child. They had been married for 4 years. She had given up her life for him, her career in marketing, her friendships, everything. Her entire world revolved around him. And this was his way of repaying her. Graham grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her skin with a cruel pressure. She was sure his grip would leave 5 dark bruises in the morning. You are going to apologize to Sienna, he hissed. And you will do it on your knees, like the pathetic wife that you are. Graham, I am pregnant. Charlotte's voice was shaking. She hated how weak and small she sounded. "I am 8 months pregnant. I can hardly put on my own shoes. My doctor said I need to be very careful." He responded, "Well, maybe you will learn to think before you open your mouth." He gave her shoulder a hard shove. Charlotte stumbled backward. Her left knee crashed onto the floor. A hot line of pain shot up her leg. Her right knee followed, hitting the marble with a thud. The baby inside her kicked hard, reacting to the shock and her fear. She used one hand to steady herself on the cold, hard floor. It was completely unforgiving. She looked up at her husband, the man she had once loved with all her heart, the man who was the father of her child. He looked down at her like she was a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Sienna rose from the sofa. She walked over to them with slow, deliberate steps. Her red-soled heels made a clicking sound on the marble, like a timer counting down to her destruction. She had on a beautiful red Valentino dress. Charlotte had seen that dress in a fashion magazine. It must have cost $15,000. The money for it probably came from the joint bank account she believed they both used. "Now apologize," Graham commanded. Charlotte could feel hot tears in her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not let them see her cry. Not in front of them. Not like this. Not while being forced to kneel in her own home. "I am sorry," she said in a low voice. The words tasted like dirt in her mouth. He said, "Speak up. I want Sienna to hear you loud and clear." "I am sorry that I said you were a liar." Sienna just smiled. It was the most heartless and evil expression Charlotte had ever witnessed. There was no kindness in her eyes, just the cold satisfaction of victory. "Do you see?" Sienna said, while stroking Graham's arm. "She can be trained, like a little dog. Maybe there is some hope for her after all." The two of them laughed, standing over her as she kneeled there, 8 months pregnant on the cold stone floor, while their baby moved restlessly within her. Her knees were in agony, and her heart felt like it was shattering into a million pieces. But there was one thing they did not know. It was something they could not possibly have guessed. In the pocket of her soft cashmere sweater, Charlotte's phone was on. The voice recording app was running, capturing everything. A small red light was blinking silently inside the dark material. It was recording every cruel command, every mocking laugh, and every single second of her shame. In only 47 days, 12 million people would listen to this exact recording in a federal courthouse. 12 million people would hear Graham order her to get on her knees. 12 million would hear Sienna's cruel laughter. And 12 million people would learn what kind of monster she had married. But Charlotte was not aware of that yet. In that moment, all she was aware of was the cold floor, the pain in her back, the worried movements of her unborn baby, and their laughter filling the vast, empty space. Graham stepped away from her. "You look pathetic down there." Charlotte slowly and painfully pushed herself up. It was a difficult process. Her balance was gone, her stomach got in the way, and her knee was throbbing with pain. Her back felt like it was being twisted, but she managed to stand. She would always find a way to stand up. "I am taking Sienna out for the evening," Graham said, without even looking at her. "We have a table at Per Se. You do not need to wait up for me." That was their restaurant. It was the place where he asked her to marry him. It was where they went for every anniversary. And now he was taking his mistress to their special place. "The baby is coming any day now," Charlotte said, though she did not know why she was bothering. "The doctor said I should not be left alone. What happens if I go into labor?" Graham did not even turn around. "Then you should call your mother. That is what she is for." He and Sienna walked out, her arm linked with his as if she were a brand new purse. The front door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid across as final as a gunshot. Charlotte was all by herself in the grand entryway. The very same entryway she had designed with so much excitement and innocent hope for their future life together. The nursery was just down the corridor. She had spent 3 months creating it. The walls were painted a soft, cheerful yellow. The white crib was specially handmade in Sweden. A mobile with tiny silver stars played a soft lullaby. Near the window was a rocking chair, the one where she had pictured herself nursing their baby while the sun set over Central Park. She had carefully considered every detail, imagining the happy family they would be. She dreamed this home would be filled with joy and love. But she now understood the truth. There was no family. There had never been a real family. For him, she was just an agreement, a way for him to have a child. That was the only thing that mattered. Charlotte walked toward the bathroom, taking one slow and painful step after another. A sharp pain went from her knee, up her leg, and into her hip. The muscles in her back were like tight ropes. Her baby was now perfectly still, as if it understood that something horrible had happened. Charlotte looked at her own face in the mirror. The mirror was framed in gold that had cost $12,000. Graham had insisted that they buy it. He told her that only the very best was good enough for his wife. At the time, she thought it was a sign of love, not a sign of ownership. Charlotte's face was as white as a sheet. Her eyes were red, but they were completely dry. The hair she had spent so much time on that morning was now a complete mess. She felt like a worn-out and broken person. Yet she refused to shed a single tear. She pulled out her phone to stop the recording. It was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. This was the proof she desperately needed. That simple file was about to change her entire world. Her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. She was completely lost and had nowhere to turn. None of what just happened felt real to her. Her thoughts were a jumbled storm inside her head. So she did what she always did when life fell apart. It was her comfort after her father's death. She did the same after losing her first job. It was her escape when life became overwhelming. She went to the garage and climbed into her car. Graham had bought her the Mercedes SUV when she got pregnant. He called it a safe car for their baby. But to her, it was just another gilded cage. For 23 minutes, she did not move at all. Charlotte stayed in her car, hidden in the garage's deep shadows. The concrete walls seemed to press in around her. A low, steady hum came from the lights above. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and old rubber. Still, no tears came. It felt like they were locked away deep inside of her. Her body seemed to enter a protective, numb state. It was walling off all the emotions that were too painful to feel. She concentrated only on her breathing, in and out, again and again. She rested her hands over her pregnant belly. The baby moved, but it was a gentle, soft kick. It felt like a small reassurance from within. It was a tiny message that said, "I am here with you, Mom. We are in this together, whatever comes next." Charlotte gazed down at her stomach, beneath her expensive sweater. This new life was growing, regardless of Graham Holt's actions. "I know," she whispered into the silent garage. "I know, my sweet little girl. Your mommy is going to fix this. I do not have a plan just yet. I am not sure of the timing, but I promise I will do it." She had no strategy and no schedule. But right then, in that dark garage with her world in ruins, Charlotte Weston decided. She was done being invisible. She would stop being the quiet, dutiful wife. She was through trying to be perfect for a man who used her like an object. A faint voice from her past echoed in her memory. It was her grandmother's voice. Eleanor Weston had raised Charlotte after her father passed when she was 16. She taught Charlotte to bake and how to handle her finances. Most importantly, she taught her to never accept disrespect from any man. Her grandmother often said, with a knowing look, when someone reveals who they truly are, you must believe it. Believe them the very first time you see it. Do not offer them another opportunity to hurt you. Do not make up reasons for their bad behavior. Never tell yourself things might get better. Just accept what they have shown you. Tonight, Graham had revealed his true nature, and Charlotte finally accepted it. She started the car, and the engine rumbled to life. She reversed from her spot and headed for the street. The lights of Manhattan glittered against the dark night sky. It was the city that never slept. It was a place where dreams were born and lives were broken daily. At first, Charlotte drove without any destination in mind. She passed towering skyscrapers, expensive stores, and the shadowy, still park. Then, a clear purpose formed in her thoughts. She needed to see Harper. Harper was the only one who was always completely honest with her. She gave Charlotte the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Harper would know the next step. Charlotte steered her car onto the Brooklyn Bridge, its huge cables soaring overhead. Below them, the dark river moved along quietly. In her rearview mirror, her old life shrank away into the distance. The luxury penthouse, the future she had imagined, the lies she had lived. She felt no sadness for what she was leaving behind. She never once glanced back. Her only focus was on driving away. Harper Finley opened the door at 11:47 at night. She was in pajamas that were covered with tiny cats. Her red hair was pulled up into a sloppy bun. She was clearly just woken up, but one look at Charlotte's face made her instantly alert. Harper stepped back, letting her friend inside without a single word. Charlotte walked into the cozy Brooklyn apartment. It was the exact opposite of her penthouse. This was 500 square feet, not 5,000. The furniture was ordinary, not imported from Italy. Books covered nearly every available surface. As a librarian, books were Harper's entire life. The apartment smelled like lavender and aged paper. It smelled like safety. It felt like a true home. Harper said, "Let me grab us some wine." Then she paused, her eyes looking at Charlotte's stomach. "Oh, wait, you cannot have wine. I will get ice cream instead." Charlotte sank into the soft, worn-out couch. Her whole body ached with a deep, throbbing pain. A bruise was already forming on her knee under her slacks. Her back felt completely wrecked. A terrible headache had been building since she read those text messages. Harper returned with 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream and 2 spoons. She handed Charlotte 1 container and 1 spoon. Then she curled up on the other end of the couch, pulled her feet up, and just waited. This was classic Harper. She never pushed for information or demanded an explanation. She did not try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She simply waited with kindness for you to be ready to talk. They had met as college freshmen. Charlotte was a shy girl from a small town, intimidated by the big city and being far from home. Harper was her roommate, on a scholarship from an even tinier town, and she had never met someone with Charlotte's kind of wealth. On paper, their friendship made no sense. They were from 2 completely different worlds. But in that simple dorm room, with its plain walls and clean sheets, they became the closest of friends. Now, 20 years later, Harper was still when Charlotte called, when her life was falling apart. Charlotte took a deep breath, and then she explained absolutely everything. She spoke about her growing suspicions over the past few months. She told her about the awful text messages on his tablet. She recounted the argument with Sienna at lunch. She described coming home to find Sienna acting like she owned the place. She explained the humiliating thing Graham had forced her to do. She mentioned the secret recording on her phone. She shared every last part, every painful detail, every vicious word, every single laugh that had cut her like a knife. Harper listened to the whole story without saying a word. Her face grew darker and angrier with each new revelation. She held her spoon in a white-knuckled grip but remained quiet. She just listened. After Charlotte finished, the room was silent for a long time. City noises drifted in from the open window. The siren of a police car wailed in the distance. From the apartment upstairs, someone was playing jazz music. The sound of a lone saxophone floated down. Finally, Harper spoke. "I have kept my mouth shut for 3 years, Charlie." Her voice was tight with suppressed rage. 3 entire years. It began at your rehearsal dinner, when I saw the way he looked at that waitress. When I heard the way he spoke to the parking valet. When I saw he had no interest in your job, your passions, or your life. Charlotte just looked at her friend in total shock. "You never said a single word to me, because you seemed happy, or at least you were pretending to be, and I could not prove anything. It was just a horrible gut feeling that got worse every time I saw you." Harper's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But I knew, Charlie. I knew he was not right for you. Graham Holt is a horrible man hiding in a designer suit. He is a beast disguised as a prince, and I am so very sorry it took this long for you to see it." Charlotte felt an enormous burden lift from her shoulders. She was so afraid Harper might judge her. She expected questions like, "Why did you wait so long?" or "How could you not see the signs?" But Harper did none of that. Instead, she just offered her friend more ice cream and gave her the words she needed to hear. "You are not going crazy," Harper said, looking directly at her. "You are certain about what you saw. You are certain about what he made you do. Do not let a single person convince you otherwise." Charlotte gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her throat felt tight with emotion. "I am not crazy," she whispered back. The words felt strong and true. "I know what I saw. I know what he did to me." They sat in silence for several minutes. The sweet cold ice cream was a simple comfort. The warm apartment felt safe and was filled with the familiar smell of old books. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Charlotte felt like she could actually take a breath. Then Harper's posture changed and she sat up straighter. Her look of sympathy was replaced by one of sharp determination. Charlotte recognized that expression very well. It was Harper's problem-solving face. "We need to find out the full extent of this," Harper stated. "You found those texts on his phone today, but that was pure luck. Could there be more? Has this been going on for even longer?" The thought had never crossed Charlotte's mind. She was so consumed by the initial shock that she never thought to dig deeper. Then an idea surfaced. "The iPad," she said suddenly. Harper gave her a confused look. "What iPad? Graham set one up for us years ago. We used it for calendars and shopping lists. But he forgot it connects to his cloud account. Every message, photo, and search is on there." Harper was already on her feet. "What is the password?" Charlotte laughed without humor. "Our wedding anniversary, August 14th. Of course he used your anniversary as the password to evidence of his affair. The nerve of these guys is just incredible. They really think they are too smart to get caught." They found the iPad in Charlotte's suitcase. She always kept it with her to see Graham's work calendar. It was a habit she was now grateful for. Her hands trembled as she typed in the password. The screen opened, displaying the usual apps. She pressed the icon for messages. At first, a few texts loaded, and then a torrent of lies filled the screen. There were not just hundreds, but thousands of texts. They were all from Sienna to Graham. This was not a recent fling. The messages dated back 2 full years. He had been with Sienna before they were even married. "Oh my gosh," Harper whispered, her face losing all color as she read over Charlotte's shoulder. "Charlie, look at this." Charlotte read the screen, and her world stopped. The text was from June 21st, 3 weeks before she walked down the aisle. She remembered that day perfectly. She was trying on her wedding gown, feeling so happy and completely clueless. Sienna had written, "When are you going to tell her? I am sick of this waiting game." Graham's response was chilling. "After the baby arrives. I need my heir. Then I will have the name, the connections, the status. Once that is settled, we can figure things out. Just be patient." Charlotte stared at his words until they blurred. An heir. That was her child to him. A pawn in a business deal to secure the Holt legacy. He never loved her. He only wanted her family's name, their social standing, her mother's money, and her father's good name. He married her for the doors she could open. Graham Holt had targeted one of the country's most powerful families. Her father had been a respected federal judge, a name that carried weight long after his death. Her mother came from the wealthy Ellsworth family, with a fortune built over generations. Graham saw his chance and took it. Charlotte now understood she was never his wife. She was a contract, a corporate merger, hidden behind a wedding. Suddenly, she was on Harper's bathroom floor. She had no memory of getting up or walking there. Yet here she was, on the cold floor, surrounded by the simple, normal things of her friend's life. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. She needed to do something to stop the trembling. She needed to feel in control of just one thing. So she started organizing Harper's medicine cabinet. It was an odd thing to do, but her hands needed work. Her mind needed a distraction from the ruin of her life. She lined up pill bottles by height. She alphabetized the labels: Advil, aspirin, Benadryl, melatonin. She folded washcloths into perfect squares. She put cotton balls into neat rows and sorted hair ties by color. She made sure every tube of toothpaste faced the front. The silly, pointless task was actually calming her down. Harper found her there 20 minutes later and just sat down on the floor with her. She said nothing, giving Charlotte the space she needed to create order in her chaos. Finally, Charlotte spoke. "He never loved me. I know, hon. He used me. I know. I feel like such an idiot, Harper." Her voice cracked, but tears would not fall. The signs were all there. "He talked about my family like they were stocks. He dropped my father's name every chance he got. He pushed for a baby right away, before we even felt like a married couple." Charlotte looked at her friend, her eyes dry and aching. "I was a business deal. That is all I was. A corporate merger wearing a wedding gown." Harper took her hand, her grip warm and solid. "Listen to me," Harper said firmly. "This is not on you. He lied to you. He is a snake in a $3,000 suit, and snakes are good at hiding. That is how they catch people." She held Charlotte's hand tighter. "You did not see it, because he made sure you could not. He built a perfect mask for years. He only took it off when he thought you were trapped. That does not make you a fool. It makes you a victim of a master manipulator." Charlotte nodded slowly. It all made sense, but it did not make her feel any better. "What do I do now?" she whispered, sounding lost. "How do I even start?" Harper's kind face hardened into a look of pure resolve. It was the look she got when she was fighting for a cause. "First things first," Harper said. "We save every single message on that iPad. Screenshot everything. Back it all up online. Email it to me. Make copies and hide them where he will never find them." Charlotte agreed. "Next, we find you the meanest divorce lawyer in this city. Someone who is not scared of rich men. Someone who can fight dirty." "Graham has all the best lawyers," Charlotte replied numbly. "They either work for him or they are afraid of him, so we find someone he does not know. An outsider. Someone hungry for a fight who has nothing to lose." Charlotte thought about it. Was there anyone in Manhattan who did not fear Graham Holt? Could a person like that really exist? Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Graham. "Do not come home tonight. Sienna is here with me. Find another place to sleep." Charlotte read the text. Something inside her shifted. The fear and pain were still there, sharp and real. But a new emotion was rising up. It was pure, hot anger. Graham thought he had won. He thought he had broken her. He expected her to plead with him, to thank him for any scrap of attention. He thought she would apologize for bothering him. He could not have been more wrong. Charlotte typed back 3 simple words. "You can have her." Then she blocked his number for good. Harper looked at the phone and a slow smile spread across her face. "There she is," Harper said softly. "That is the Charlie I know. The woman who got a perfect 4.0 grade point average while working 2 jobs. The one who challenged that awful professor. The Charlie who never quit." Charlotte did not feel like that person anymore. She felt new, forged in the fire of betrayal. And maybe that was what she needed to be to survive what was coming next. This was not going to be a simple divorce. This was going to be a war. Graham would use his money, his lawyers, and all his connections against her. But she had the one thing he did not have. She had the truth. She had the proof. She had a recording that would destroy him. And in 45 days, that truth would make him pay for everything. The Ellsworth family home had been in her family for 4 generations. It was on a quiet street on the Upper East Side, a place of old money and quiet power. It was wealth so established, it never had to be loud. That house was Margot Ellsworth Weston's entire world. Charlotte's mother was born upstairs and wed her father in the garden. She brought up her children within its walls. She mourned her husband in the front room and found the strength to go on. Now, Charlotte sat across from her mother in that same room. The tea in the antique cups was as cold as the feeling between them. Sunlight sliced across an ancient rug, casting long, deep shadows. Margot was 58 years old. She wore her silver hair like a badge of honor, a testament to her endurance. Her pearls were a constant, whether she was at the market or walking her dog. The family valued composure, believing emotions were a private matter. But Charlotte knew her mother had an unbreakable strength. She witnessed it when her father died at 52. Opportunistic relatives and lawyers swarmed, thinking a grieving widow was weak. Margot handled them with a cold, swift precision. The Weston fortune remained completely untouched. Charlotte laid out the entire ugly truth for her mother. She described the cheating, the harsh words, the recording, and the shame. She shared every hurtful moment in the very house where she had learned about love. Margot listened to the horrible tale without a flicker of expression. The tight grip on her teacup was her only giveaway. When Charlotte finished, a heavy silence filled the space. The old clock ticked away the seconds. Then her mother finally broke the quiet. "I investigated Graham's history before your engagement." The color drained from Charlotte's face, and her hands felt frozen. Her heart seemed to pause in her chest. "What?" she breathed, the sound almost lost. Her mother's blue eyes, identical to her own, met hers. Charlotte once loved that they looked alike. Now she questioned if she had any of her mother's intuition. I hired a professional to look into him, Margot continued. Her tone was steady, but it was heavy with regret. It was the ache of someone who saw a tragedy coming but could not prevent it. For 3 months, I had every part of his life examined, she explained. His work, his romantic history, all of it. Then why did you keep silent? Charlotte's question was laced with pain. If you had doubts, because I had nothing concrete. For the first time, a tremor entered Margot's voice. I discovered odd things. Female employees leaving his company abruptly. Quiet financial payouts and non-disclosure forms. It all seemed wrong, but there was no hard evidence. It was not enough to warn a woman in love that her fiancé was a threat. Charlotte stared at the woman who was supposed to be her shield, the one who was never wrong, the one who allowed her to marry a man she doubted. You saw the danger, Charlotte said, her voice empty. You saw it and you said nothing. But you were glowing with happiness, Margot answered. A lone tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, annoyed at her own lack of control. You were so deeply in love. You were on a cloud after you first met him. I had not seen you that happy since your father was alive. Her voice was thick with feeling. I had feelings, not facts. I tried to dismiss it as a mother's worry. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Charlotte felt a scream building inside her. A fire of betrayal burned, not just for her husband, but for her mother as well. But beneath the anger was a deep, weary exhaustion. What is done, Charlotte said at last. We have to deal with the present. Margot nodded. She pulled a business card from her pocket. The paper was heavy, costly, and the color of cream. Bennett Shaw, Margot said, sliding the card across the table. He is the best divorce attorney on the East Coast, possibly in the entire country. He has won 3 of the most significant cases in the past 10 years. He takes on powerful men with unlimited resources. Charlotte took the card. The name was embossed in gold. His record is flawless, her mother continued. Has Graham heard of him? Unlikely. Bennett works quietly. No ads, no galas. His clients find him when they need to win an unwinnable fight. Charlotte looked closely at her mother, noticing the fine lines of stress she worked to hide. You have been getting ready for this, Charlotte said. It was a statement, not a question. I have been prepared, Margot corrected softly. That is not the same thing. I prayed you would never need this. I hoped my feelings about Graham were just a mother's overactive imagination. All I ever wanted was your happiness. She took a breath. But I kept his card. It is what mothers do. Hope for the best, but always prepare for the worst. 3 days passed and Charlotte found herself in Bennett Shaw's office. It was on the 34th floor, overlooking Central Park. His walls were a gallery of his triumphs. Framed news clippings celebrated huge victories in justice for his clients. Bennett was 45, with graying hair and an expression that gave nothing away. His sharp eyes seemed to notice everything. His suit was simple but costly. He projected an aura of skill, certainty, and immense resolve. He listened to her whole account with his hands clasped before him. His face was a perfect mask of neutrality. He did not react to the affair or to the humiliation. Then she pressed play on her phone. Get on your knees. Graham's cruel voice invaded the calm office. Charlotte watched Bennett, searching for a sign. And then she saw it. A brief flicker deep in his eyes. A muscle in his jaw flexed. The audio ended with her own broken admission. I am sorry for accusing you of lying. Her shaky voice died out in the room. Bennett was quiet for a second before he spoke. His tone was deliberate. Holt, Weston, Charlotte interrupted with force. I am going by Weston now. I will not use his name anymore. Bennett nodded once, his expression showing clear respect. Weston. He then said, what your husband did qualifies as emotional abuse and control. Given that you are pregnant, it is also reckless endangerment. We can use that recording as evidence. New York has powerful laws for cases like this. What about the text messages? Charlotte inquired. The ones proving he set this all up? They establish premeditation, Bennett replied. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. Graham Holt planned to exploit you from day one. The marriage, the child, all of it was a calculated move. The words were true. But hearing them spoken so bluntly made them horribly real. So where do we go from here? She asked. Bennett leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "We are going to do more than file for divorce, miss. We are going to make sure everyone knows exactly who he is. We will expose every deception, every scheme, and every woman he has hurt. Everyone will see the real Graham Holt. Then, his money and power will be worthless." The knot of fear in Charlotte's chest started to loosen. It felt like she could breathe for the first time in ages. A small spark of hope returned. "But he will fight back, won't he?" she said. "He has a lot of money and connections. He has friends in government, law, and the press." "He does," Bennett agreed. "And he will use all of it to try and destroy you. He will attack your reputation, your sanity, and your fitness as a mother. He will pay a fortune to slander you." Bennett paused, then offered a sharp, confident smile. "But his influence is not everything. The truth is a powerful weapon. Once that recording plays in court, his reputation is finished." Charlotte nodded slowly. She knew she had to trust him. "There is one more thing," she said. "You need to understand this before we proceed. Go on." Charlotte put her hands over her belly. Inside, the baby kicked, as if to offer its support. "This is not about revenge," she stated. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I do not want to destroy Graham for the sake of it. This is for my child. She deserves better." She wanted her daughter to see that her mother refused to be treated like property. She wanted a world where women fight back. She met Bennett's gaze directly. "I need my daughter to see that no one is above the law. I need her to understand that truth matters and that you can find justice." She finished. "Everyone must face the outcome of what they do." Bennett was quiet for a moment. For the first time, a genuine emotion showed on his face. "This is precisely the kind of case I was made for," he said at last. "Let's get to work." Over the next 3 hours, they dissected every single detail of her life with Graham. They went over the affair, the messages on the tablet, and the audio recording. They reviewed her financial situation and the prenuptial agreement he had insisted on. Now she understood it was only to shield his assets. As Charlotte left, her thoughts were a whirlwind. Yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sliver of hope. She stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, and the city's energy enveloped her. It was a world completely unaware of her small, private victory. Cars honked, tourists took photos, and people in suits hurried past, eyes fixed on their screens. The world just kept moving. Life simply carried on. Far above the streets, in the penthouse she once called a prison, Graham Holt was oblivious to the storm that was coming. Charlotte glanced at her phone and saw a new text from Harper. "So how did it go?" it read. A real smile spread across Charlotte's face for the first time in days. "I have just declared war," she typed back, "and I plan to win." Graham Holt did not react well to the divorce filing. Charlotte learned this just 3 days later, when a call came from her personal banker. "I am dreadfully sorry, Mrs. Holt," he began. His voice was smooth and practiced, filled with professional sympathy. "We have received an order from the court. Your accounts have been frozen pending a legal review." A chill went through Charlotte's hands as she gripped the phone. "I do not understand. My name is the only one on those accounts. They are separate from my husband." The banker responded, "I realize that, ma'am, but the court received an emergency motion. It alleges a misuse of marital assets. Until this is resolved, we are legally blocked from authorizing any transactions. I truly apologize." Charlotte hung up the phone. She was back in her mother's house, staying in the guest room since that terrible evening. She stared at the floral wallpaper, covered in roses and other blooms. She had picked that wallpaper when she was 16, shortly after her father died. Her mother thought redecorating would ease her grief. Now, at 32, she was back in the same room, hiding from her husband. The flowers on the wall seemed to mock her now. Graham's goal was clear. He wanted to drain her finances, to make her helpless, and force her to crawl back to him. Charlotte immediately called Bennett. "This is a classic tactic," Bennett said. His voice was steady, as if he had been expecting this all along. "When a controlling man starts losing his grip, he attacks the money. It is a textbook move. No money means no freedom. But I cannot get to my money. The baby is due in 3 weeks. I have doctor's appointments and other bills. I cannot even afford groceries." Bennett said, "Your mother has already set up a trust. I spoke with her attorney this morning. You will have access to funds within 24 hours. Graham's legal team can try anything they like. They can file motions and make threats, but they have no claim on assets outside the marriage. The Ellsworth Trust is much older than your wedding vows. Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling the pressure in her chest ease. He is not going to stop, is he? She asked. He will just keep finding new ways to hurt me. He will always try to catch me off guard. Yes, Bennett replied honestly. She was beginning to appreciate that he never sugarcoated the truth. That is how he functions. He will use dirty tricks because it is all he knows. But you must remember this. He paused for a moment, his tone becoming firmer. I need you to understand, every move he makes, every nasty little scheme, every attempt to frighten you, it all becomes evidence for our case. It shows the court his true character. Let him dig his own grave. Let him prove he is the kind of man who would crush his pregnant wife. We will be there to give him the final push. That afternoon, Graham's public relations firm issued a formal statement. Charlotte read it on her phone while sitting in her mother's kitchen, her tea forgotten. Harper had left the library early to sit with her. From the next room, she could hear her mother, Margot, speaking with her own lawyer. Graham Holt is devastated by his wife's decision to end their marriage. He wishes only the best for her and their child. He hopes they can co-parent peacefully and asks for privacy during this difficult time. Charlotte read the words again and again, feeling sicker each time. The statement was a work of art. It painted Graham as the wounded party, the victim of a wife's sudden whim. By mentioning their unborn child, he appeared to be a responsible, caring father who only wanted peace. It was a beautiful lie, like poison served in a crystal glass. The online comments were brutal. Just another gold digger trying to get a payday. I bet she was the one who cheated. Poor Graham. He always came across as such a gentleman. Women like her are a disgrace. She marries a billionaire and suddenly cries abuse. Harper snatched the phone away. Do not read that filth, she said firmly. You should never, ever read the comment section. Those people have no idea who you are or what happened. It is all just meaningless garbage. Charlotte nodded, but the venom had already seeped into her mind. The public had branded her a liar and a gold digger. She hoped the audio recording would prove them wrong. They would hear Graham's cold voice command her to get on her knees, followed by Sienna's laughter. She held on to that hope, but her certainty was fading. In some ways, the other comments were even worse. She must be so scared. I really hope she gets some help. We have to believe victims. Bless her poor heart. She looks so fragile. They pitied her. They cast her as a weak victim, a damsel who needed saving. But Charlotte was not helpless or fragile. She was not waiting for someone to rescue her. She was a woman who had been beaten down but was climbing back to her feet. She was a woman who was fighting for her life, a woman who would never kneel again. But that version of the story did not seem to interest anyone. They wanted the weeping victim or the greedy villain. Nothing in between was allowed. Late that night, around 2 a.m, Harper found Charlotte in the kitchen. Flour coated the counters, and the sweet smell of apples and cinnamon filled the air. Charlotte was rolling out pie dough with a blank, automatic expression. "What are you doing up?" Harper asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I am making my grandmother's apple pie," Charlotte replied, her tone flat and distant. "It is the only thing that seems to make any sense right now." Harper sat down at the kitchen counter. She watched her friend work, peeling apples and mixing spices exactly as her grandma Eleanor had taught her. "You know, it is okay to not be strong every minute of the day," Harper said softly. Charlotte's hands stopped moving. "I have to be," she said finally, her voice shaking slightly. "If I let myself fall apart for even a second, I will never get back up. I cannot afford to do that. Not with the baby coming, and not with Graham trying to destroy me. I have to hold on." She went back to the dough, and the only sounds were the soft rhythms of her work. The air grew warm with the smell of butter, sugar, and the heating oven. "This is what Grandma Eleanor always did," Charlotte said softly. "After Grandpa passed, after my father passed, anytime something terrible happened, she baked. She said it was the one thing her hands remembered how to do when her heart was lost." Harper's eyes grew misty. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise person." "She was the strongest woman I ever knew." Charlotte's voice cracked. "I am trying so hard to be like her, but I am just not sure that I can do this." Harper got up and wrapped her arms around her friend from behind. "You can do this," Harper whispered into her hair. "And you are not doing it alone." Charlotte did not eat any of the pie. The act of making it was what mattered. Creating something with her hands offered a small bit of control in her chaotic world. It was a connection to her past, to the strong women in her family. She covered the finished pie and left it on the counter. Maybe her mother would have a piece tomorrow, maybe not. It did not really matter. The following week, two major things happened. The first was a meeting Harper had scheduled with a journalist named Vera Morrison, a writer for The Atlantic magazine. Vera was 43, with intelligent eyes and a fearsome reputation for exposing powerful men. Her articles had brought down a tech mogul, a university president, and a famous televangelist. Each one had ended in public shame. They met in a small cafe. Charlotte felt silly wearing a hat and sunglasses, like a character in a bad spy movie. Bennett had insisted, warning her that Graham would have people watching her every move. Vera wasted no time with small talk. "I have been investigating Graham Holt's business practices for 18 months, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable intensity. His business tactics, the way he handles employees, how he crushes his competition and buries his mistakes. I know he is dirty, but his lawyers are just too good to ever prove it. Every move he makes is technically legal, even though it is morally bankrupt." Charlotte asked, "So, why are you and I talking?" Vera leaned in, her gaze intense. "Because this is different. The pattern of abuse, the detailed planning, the proof you have. Charlotte, this is far beyond your divorce. This is about how powerful men use marriage like a tool. They use women to build their empires and then just throw them away. They get away with it because of their money, their connections, and their teams of lawyers and public relations people." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She stirred her coffee, watching the creamy swirls form and then disappear. "If I go public with my story," she said slowly, "my daughter will be tied to it forever. Every time someone looks her up online, this will be there. For every school she applies to, every job interview, every new person she meets, they will all read about how her father forced his pregnant wife to her knees." "That is right," Vera said. She didn't try to sugarcoat the truth, which Charlotte was grateful for. "That is the cost. You have to decide if it is a price you are willing to pay. But if I stay silent, Graham gets away with everything. He just moves on with his life like nothing ever happened. And other women could suffer the same way I did. Future partners, other women he charms, who do not see the monster he is until they are trapped." Vera nodded in agreement. "That is also true." Charlotte thought about her unborn child, Eleanor, and the kind of world she would be born into. A world where men like Graham are never held responsible, where they could hurt a pregnant woman and carry on without a single consequence. A world where wealth and power can conceal any crime and silence any victim. Or it could be a world where women speak up, tell their stories no matter how hard it is, and refuse to be silenced by the powerful. Charlotte made her decision. "I will do the interview," she said firmly, "but not until after the baby is born. After I have had time to heal and feel ready for what will happen next." Vera gave a supportive nod. She reached across the table and gave Charlotte's hand a gentle squeeze. "You are so much stronger than you think you are," Vera said to her. Charlotte did not believe it. She did not feel strong in the slightest. She just felt a deep sense of dread and was completely worn out. It felt like she was just barely holding herself together. But she had come to understand something important. It was something her grandmother had taught her years ago. Courage was not about being fearless. Courage was feeling that fear and doing the right thing anyway. She took the last sip of her coffee, tugged her hat down, and walked out into the biting cold of the Manhattan streets. Her baby was due in 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to prepare for the greatest challenge she had ever faced. She was as ready as she would ever be. And then her water broke at the absolute worst time imaginable. Charlotte was at a charity fundraiser. It was the Hartwell Foundation's annual gala for children's literacy programs. The gala was in a magnificent ballroom at the Pierre Hotel. There were crystal chandeliers, crisp white tablecloths, women in designer gowns, and men in black tuxedos. It was the kind of event where fortunes were donated and everyone pretended to be a good person. Charlotte had forced herself to attend for one simple reason. Graham would be there. She had to show him that she was not hiding, that she was not ashamed, and that his attempts to break her spirit had failed. Her plan was to walk into that room with her head held high, proving to him that she was no longer his victim. It had taken her 2 hours to get ready, with Harper's assistance. They chose a dark emerald gown that cascaded over her belly at 8.5 months pregnant. The dress was elegant and sophisticated, making a statement without being flashy. Harper had done Charlotte's hair in a complicated style she had seen online. Her makeup was perfect, yet subtle. She looked absolutely beautiful, and she was well aware of it. She wanted Graham to see precisely what he had lost. She spotted him the moment she walked into the crowded ballroom. He was over by the bar, nursing a glass of scotch. Sienna was beside him in a scarlet dress that was far too daring for a charity event. The two of them were sharing a laugh. Sienna's hand was casually placed on Graham's arm. "Charlotte, you look radiant. Being a mother suits you so well. When are you due? You must be so excited." She simply smiled and made polite small talk, hiding the fact that her world was falling apart, hiding her plan to ruin the man across the room. And then she felt it. A sudden gush of warmth, a dampness soaking through her dress, and a sharp contraction in her stomach that was definitely the real thing. Please, not now. Not here, with hundreds of people staring. But it seemed her baby had other plans. Charlotte reached for the bar to steady herself. Her sight went fuzzy, and the room's colors smeared together. The giant chandeliers overhead started to spin like distant stars. A woman next to her gasped. "Oh dear, did your water just break?" Charlotte looked down. Her lovely green dress was now dark with a spreading stain around her legs. A small puddle was forming on the polished marble floor. Her water had indeed broken, right in the middle of the Pierre Hotel, in front of 700 people, in front of Graham and Sienna and everyone she had ever known. "I think someone needs to call an ambulance," she heard herself say. Her own voice sounded oddly calm, as if it belonged to someone else. "The baby is coming." The moments that followed were complete chaos. People began to scramble, reaching for their cell phones. Camera flashes went off as journalists captured the scene for the morning papers and gossip sites. Women in their elegant gowns backed away from the puddle. Men in their tuxedos just looked on, unsure of what to do in such a raw and messy situation. Through all the commotion, Charlotte caught a glimpse of Graham's face. He looked utterly horrified. He was not worried about her or their child, not concerned for her well-being. He was simply mortified that his private drama was now a public spectacle, that his carefully crafted image was being destroyed by his wife going into labor while his mistress looked on. Sienna's face showed a mix of shock and pure satisfaction. It was like she was enjoying the moment. It was as if she wanted to witness Charlotte's humiliation. She seemed to believe this public disaster was exactly what Charlotte had coming. Charlotte filed those images away. She would unpack them later, because she had much more urgent things to focus on. The paramedics arrived in just a few minutes. They got Charlotte onto a gurney. Her emerald gown was completely soaked, and her perfectly applied makeup was now streaked with sweat. The emergency medical technicians were kind and efficient. They asked her about her contractions, how far apart they were, and how many weeks along she was. She did her best to answer, but her thoughts were on the photos that were already flooding the internet. Charlotte Weston in her green gown being wheeled out of the gala. Graham and Sienna just standing in the background, watching. The narrative was writing itself. The tabloids were going to have a field day. And for the very first time, Charlotte truly did not care. Her labor went on for 17 hours. 17 agonizing hours of pain and pressure, a feeling like her body was being torn apart from the inside. For 17 hours, she gripped her mother's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white. For 17 hours, Harper coached her through her breathing, dabbed her forehead with a cool washcloth, and kept telling her how amazing she was. She was so strong. She was almost at the end. Graham eventually showed up at the hospital around the 8th hour. Charlotte got the full story later from the security guard Bennett had hired. Graham had apparently stormed onto the maternity floor as if he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. The Holt family had paid for the wing's new medical equipment 5 years before. A bronze plaque with their name was on the wall by the entrance. "That is my wife," Graham had yelled at the nursing staff. and that is my baby. I have a right to be in that room." But the guard, a former Marine named Marcus, was not impressed. "Sir, Mrs. Weston gave specific instructions for no visitors. Your name is not on her approved list. Do you have any idea who I am? I will have your job. I will see to it this whole hospital is defunded." Marcus's response had been calm, almost cheerful. "You can give it a try, sir. But right now, you need to leave this floor. If you do not leave voluntarily, I will have to call the police, and the press will have an even better story." Graham reportedly left in a rage, his face red with anger. Charlotte wished she could have seen it, but she was occupied with more pressing business. At 4:27 in the morning, after 17 hours of intense labor, Eleanor Charlotte Weston was born. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She had a thick patch of dark hair, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a small mouth, and eyes that would probably turn blue like Charlotte's. Dr. Patricia Brennan gently placed the newborn on Charlotte's chest. The baby felt impossibly light, precious, and utterly perfect. "She is gorgeous," Dr. Brennan said softly. "You did an incredible job, Charlotte. You were so very strong." Charlotte gazed down at her daughter, this little person who had been growing inside of her for 9 months. This baby girl had been with her through all of it. Eleanor had been there for everything, growing and waiting, and now she was finally here in her arms. "Eleanor," Charlotte whispered. "Named for my grandmother. We will call you Ellie." The baby's eyes fluttered open. They were the dark, deep blue of a newborn, a color that would change over time. But Charlotte could already see something in them, a look that was determined and resilient. She saw a spirit that would refuse to be broken or diminished. "You will know your own worth from the moment you are born," Charlotte whispered to her new daughter. Tears began to run down her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to cry since that horrible night. "No man will ever make you feel small. No one will ever force you to apologize for being you. I promise you that, Eleanor." The baby made a soft noise, not a cry, but a sound of contentment. Charlotte held her daughter, breathing in that sweet baby scent, and felt complete for the first time in months. A nurse came in hours later with paperwork. Charlotte had gotten some rest. Eleanor was sleeping in a bassinet beside her. Harper dozed in a chair by the window. Margot went home to shower, promising to return with real food. "We need to finish the birth certificate," the nurse said softly. "I am sorry to wake you, but these forms are rather urgent." Charlotte took the clipboard and scanned the paper. It requested the usual information for a newborn, including the mother's name and then the father's name. Charlotte stared at the empty line where Graham Holt's name should have been. The law would probably require it. She recalled the affair, the hateful messages, and his entire plan to use her. The humiliation, the frozen bank accounts, the public lies, and his arrival at the hospital. He had demanded to see Eleanor as if she were an object he owned. Her pen hovered just above the line. Then, with a firm hand and zero hesitation, she wrote a single word: unknown. She knew it was a spiteful act. Bennett would likely call it a poor choice that would complicate the custody fight. Graham's lawyers would certainly use it against her. But in every way that mattered, it was the absolute truth. Graham was not a real father. He never wanted to be one. He did not desire a daughter. He wanted an heir for the Holt dynasty. He wanted a name on legal forms, not a child to love. Eleanor deserved a father who wanted her, or she was better off with no father at all. Charlotte handed the form back. The nurse's eyebrows shot up when she saw it. But she stayed quiet. She just gave a nod and left the room. The official certificate was filed the next day. A copy was promptly sent to Graham's legal team. According to Bennett, his reaction was explosive. "He is demanding a paternity test," Bennett said over the phone. Charlotte was still in the hospital, holding Eleanor. "He is threatening to sue for defamation and parental alienation." It is the typical tantrum of a man who is not used to hearing the word no. Charlotte looked down at her baby's tiny, peaceful face. "Let him try," Charlotte said. Her voice was steady and strong. "He can demand all he wants. He can use every legal trick in his book. I am not afraid of him anymore." And she really meant it. As she looked at Eleanor, Charlotte had a realization. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. She had this little person who depended on her, who trusted her, and who needed her to be strong. She's had her mother, who had waited so long for this day. She had Harper, who dropped everything to be by her side. She had Bennett, a lawyer who had never lost a case. Graham had his money. He had his influence and his powerful friends. But Charlotte had something much more valuable. She had the truth. She had love. She had a daughter worth fighting for. And her struggle was just getting started. 6 weeks after Eleanor's birth, Charlotte received a call from a number she did not recognize. She was in her mother's bright room, feeding the baby. Eleanor was getting bigger and more alert. She had even begun to smile, true smiles that lit up her face and filled Charlotte's heart. The caller ID was unfamiliar. Normally she would ignore it, but for some reason, she answered. "Weston, this is Deacon Holt." Charlotte almost dropped the phone. Deacon Holt was Graham's father, the man who built the Holt empire from nothing. He had created a fortune and raised a terrible son. Charlotte had met him only 4 times. He always looked at her like she was another expensive item in his house. "Holt," she said carefully, "I am surprised you are calling me. I am sure that you are." His voice sounded old and weak, but she could hear the power underneath. It was the same power that built a business empire and crushed all rivals. "I want to meet with you in private. There is something you need to know." Charlotte's mind raced. She was certain it was a trick. Deacon was surely helping his son, Graham. This was just another one of their manipulative games. "Why should I ever trust you?" she asked. "You shouldn't," he answered, and she detected a note of respect in his tone. "You should not trust anyone connected with my son, but the information I have can assist you, and it appears you need all the assistance you can get." Charlotte thought about her choices. Her gut told her this was a terrible idea, and she should just call Bennett. But something in Deacon's voice made her hesitate. It sounded like regret, like a man seeing his life clearly for the first time. "Where?" she finally asked. "There is a small diner in Queens, Margie's on Roosevelt Avenue. It has been there since 1953. We will not be recognized. I will be there on Thursday at 2. 2 days later, Charlotte walked into Margie's diner. It was just as she had imagined. The diner had old vinyl booths and a worn counter. Deacon Holt was in a booth in the back. He looked smaller and much older than she remembered. He used a cane and his hands shook as he held his cup. But his sharp blue eyes were the same as Graham's, with that same coldness. It was like looking at what Graham could become in 30 years. That is, if he even lived that long. Charlotte sat across from him. A waitress came by, poured her coffee without a word, and left. "Thank you for coming," Deacon said. "Thank you for the invitation," Charlotte replied, with a chill in her voice. "Now please tell me why you asked me here." Deacon paused for a moment. He held his cup with trembling, spotted hands as if drawing warmth from it. He stared out at the busy street, at the ordinary people living their lives. It was a world so different from his own. "My son has brought shame upon this family," he said finally. "For what must be decades, I knew about the affairs and the hush money. I saw the women who simply disappeared. The signs were always there for anyone who cared to look." Charlotte felt a cold shiver. "How many were there?" she asked. "After 12, I stopped keeping count." Deacon's voice was hollow, like he was discussing stock prices, not people. "I told myself it was not my place to get involved. Graham's personal life was his business. As long as the company did well and the Holt name was respected, I looked away. But now I have seen the video." Deacon looked up, meeting Charlotte's eyes. For the first time, she saw a flicker of humanity in them. It was a look that was almost like shame. "I watched my own son force a pregnant woman to her knees. I heard him tell her to apologize in that particular voice. It was the same voice I taught him to use for business deals, for takeovers, for ruining his enemies." He stopped, his jaw clenched. "And I realized I taught him to treat people like that. I showed him that power is all that matters. I taught him money can fix anything and that rules were for others. I made him think that empathy was a weakness." Charlotte just stared at the old man. The anger she expected never came. Instead, she felt a strange, sad connection. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Deacon pulled a small, black flash drive from his jacket. He slid it across the table to her. 40 years of documents," he said. "Every woman Graham harmed, every payment, every non-disclosure agreement is on here. It has names, dates, and amounts. It is the full record his lawyers worked for decades to bury." Charlotte picked up the drive. It felt light as a feather, but she knew what it held. It was proof. It was the weapon she needed to destroy Graham Holt. "This is enough to ruin him," she whispered. "Yes, why would you betray your son?" Deacon was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw and broken. "Because I am the one who failed him," he confessed. "I taught him to believe power was everything. I made him think money could buy him whatever he wanted. I taught him that people like us are above the law. I am the one who made this monster." He paused, swallowing hard. "The least I can do now is help you stop him." Charlotte searched the old man's face. She looked for a trick or a hidden reason. She was still expecting a trap. All she saw was pure exhaustion, what looked like grief, and something else. It looked like the final, desperate wish of a dying man to do one right thing before the end. "There is more," Deacon added. "I am willing to testify in court. I will tell them everything I know about my son. I will detail every pattern, every victim, and every cover-up I ignored." Charlotte felt a powerful shift inside her. This was the key to everything. This was how she would finally win. Graham could paint her as a bitter wife seeking revenge. He could claim she was a liar, looking for a bigger payout. But his own father testifying against him was a completely different story. That was the kind of evidence nobody could possibly ignore. "How do I know you will follow through?" Charlotte asked him directly. "Your sense of family loyalty could return at the last second. Your lawyers might say you were not of sound mind, or that I somehow tricked you." Deacon managed a faint smile. It was the exhausted, defeated smile of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Because I am dying," he said simply. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have 6 months, maybe less. They told me it is too late for any surgery." Charlotte was speechless and could only sit in silence. "I will not face the end without trying to fix some part of this mess," Deacon continued. "I cannot undo what Graham did. I cannot return the years or the trust he took from those women. But I can tell the truth. I can finally do that before my time runs out." They sat quietly for another moment. A sad song about lost love played softly from the jukebox. Their coffee grew cold as the afternoon sun started to set. Finally, Charlotte found her voice. "Thank you," she said. "And for what it is worth, I believe you." Deacon nodded slowly. "Take care of that little girl. Create a better world for her than the one I helped make." "I plan to," she replied. Charlotte left the diner with the flash drive tucked safely in her pocket. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of powerful hope. She felt a strong certainty that things were about to change. She knew that Graham Holt's perfect world was about to come crashing down. That night, in her mother's guest room, Charlotte finally let her emotions break free. Eleanor was sleeping peacefully in the nursery just down the hall. The baby monitor on the nightstand gently relayed the sound of her soft breathing. The house was completely quiet. Margot was already asleep. The sounds of the city outside were muffled and distant, hushed by the cold winter air. Then, the full weight of everything hit Charlotte all at once. She sat on the edge of the teenage bed she had grown up in. She stared at the familiar flower-patterned wallpaper. She looked out at the same garden where she used to play as a little girl. It was where her father had pushed her on the swing, and where she had dreamed about her own future. She had imagined a life of love and happiness, with a partner who cherished her, the way her father cherished her mother. She never in her wildest dreams imagined a life that looked like this. The tears she had been holding back finally began to stream down her face. For weeks, she had stayed strong, refusing to let Graham see her suffering. She cried for the marriage she believed she had. She cried for the man she thought she knew. She wept for the future that had been stolen from her, for the family she desperately wanted, and for the life she once thought was genuine. She cried for Eleanor, who would grow up either without a father or with one who saw her as a possession. She cried for the hopeful young woman she once was, who walked down the aisle 4 years ago, so certain that love could conquer all. She cried until she was completely empty, with no tears left. Then, she got up. She went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet for a bath. The water was steaming hot, filling the small room with a thick fog. She slid into the tub, letting the water come up to her chin, and felt the deep warmth soak into her bones. She did not check her phone. She pushed away all thoughts of Graham, the lawsuit, or the trial. For a little while, She simply floated in the quiet, warm silence. Her body was still healing from childbirth. She still had aches and pains, and her body did not feel like her own. But it was getting better. With each passing day and week, she felt herself growing stronger. She stayed in the tub until the water grew cold. Then she stood, dried off, and put on her grandmother's old robe. Margot had kept it for years, and it still smelled faintly of lavender and rose. She caught herself mentally practicing what she would say to Graham, a habit she had formed over the past weeks. She was justifying herself, defending her choices, trying to make him see her side. She forced herself to stop. "I do not owe him an explanation," she said out loud. Her voice echoed off the bathroom tiles. "I never did. I do not have to explain myself to him. I do not need his understanding. I just need to get through this. And after I get through it, I need to win." Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She was going to ignore it, but an instinct told her to check. It was a text message from Bennett. "Our judge is Ruth Peaton. They call her the Equalizer." Charlotte stared at the screen. She knew that name. Anyone connected to the legal world knew that name. Ruth Peaton was an absolute legend. She was a federal judge who had presided over some of the most important cases in the last 20 years. She was famous for making powerful men answer for their actions. She could see right through expensive lawyers and complicated legal games. She brought justice where others failed. She had sent chief executive officers to prison. She had brought down major corporations that acted like they were above the law. She had given a voice to people who had been silenced for too long. And now, she would be the judge in Charlotte's case. Charlotte smiled. For the first time in a very long time, it was a real smile that reached her eyes. It looked like maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning in her favor. The trial began on a Tuesday in the middle of January. It was a gray and cold morning, the kind of day that makes you want to stay in bed. But Charlotte had been awake since 5 in the morning. Sleep was impossible. She kept reviewing her testimony in her head for what felt like the 100th time. She arrived at the federal courthouse through a side entrance. Bennett had arranged it to help her avoid the media circus out front. Dozens of news vans were already parked there. Reporters stood shivering in the cold, hungry for any detail of the story. But even the private entrance had cameras waiting. Photographers shouted her name. Microphones were shoved in her direction. Questions were yelled from all sides. "Charlotte, how does it feel to face your husband in court? Is it true Graham's own father is testifying against him? What is your message for other women who are in your situation?" Charlotte kept her eyes down and just kept walking forward. She let her security team clear a path for her. All she had to do was put one foot in front of the other. That was her only job in that moment. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected. The walls were paneled with dark, serious-looking wood. The bright fluorescent lights from above made everyone look a little washed out. The wooden benches were filling up fast with reporters, curious onlookers, and people who had lined up for hours just to watch. Graham was already there. He sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 3 lawyers in matching dark gray suits. With their sharp clothing, perfect hair, and expensive briefcases, they looked like actors from a legal drama. Graham wore a navy suit, a perfect white shirt, and a red tie. It was the uniform of a powerful man, a costume for someone who was absolutely sure he would win. He looked totally confident and relaxed, as if this was just another business meeting. It was just another deal to close, another person to brush aside to get what he wanted. His eyes met Charlotte's as she walked toward her table, and he gave her a small smile. It was the same cold, hollow smile that once tricked her into believing he loved her, but now she saw it for what it truly was. It was the smirk of a predator that had its victim trapped. Bennett put a gentle hand on her arm. "Do not look at him. Do not give him a reaction. Do not give him that satisfaction." Charlotte nodded, took her seat at the table and arranged her papers, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone in the room rose to their feet. Judge Ruth Peaton entered the courtroom. She was 61 years old, with short, no-nonsense gray hair and an unreadable expression. She wore the standard black robe of a judge, but on her, it looked different. It seemed less like a costume and more like the uniform of someone who took her job very seriously. She had a quiet authority that did not need to be spoken. It just filled the space around her. Charlotte had known powerful men who did not command half the respect this woman did. "Please be seated," Judge Peaton said. Her voice was steady and firm, with no room for debate. "This court is now in session. Case number 24372, Weston versus Holt." The first day was mostly about procedures and opening statements from both legal teams. The complicated legal language made Charlotte's head ache. Bennett's opening statement was calm and direct, simply laying out the facts of the case without any extra drama. He discussed the affair, the scheming, the cruelty, and the audio recording. His voice was unwavering for the full 45 minutes. Graham's lawyer, a man with silver hair named Harrison Pike, took a very different approach. He portrayed Graham as a loving husband who only made mistakes because of the incredible pressure of his career. He suggested that Charlotte was being overly emotional and playing the victim just to get a larger settlement. Charlotte sat perfectly still while Pike spoke. Her face remained blank, but inside, a quiet rage was building. Playing the victim, she had a recording of her husband forcing her to her knees. She had text messages that laid out his entire cruel plan. She had evidence of his cruelty to women stretching back 40 years. No one could call that an exaggeration. The trial lasted for 6 long days. It was filled with testimony, proof, and endless questions. For 6 days, Graham's lawyers used every trick they knew to paint Charlotte as unstable and a liar. Charlotte took the stand on the 3rd day. She sat in the witness chair for 4 hours. Bennett gently guided her with his questions, helping her tell her story clearly. She spoke about their first dates, the wedding, the happy early years, and the red flags she chose to ignore, leading up to that terrible night. Charlotte recalled every single detail, every word that was said, and every emotion she felt. She spoke in a calm, factual voice, allowing the truth to speak for itself. She did not cry a single tear. All her crying was finished. Her only job was to be honest. Then, Bennett played the recording, and a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The journalists lowered their pens. Even Graham's own lawyers stopped their hushed whispers. "Get on your knees." Graham's voice filled the room. It was icy, commanding, and cruel. It was the voice of a man who expected everyone to obey him. It was the voice of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Charlotte scanned the faces around her. She looked at the spectators, the reporters, the attorneys, and even Judge Peaton, whose professional mask slipped for just a moment. She saw expressions of shock, horror, and pure disgust. And for a fleeting second on Graham's face, before he regained his look of confidence, she saw something new. She saw fear. He was afraid. He was not worried about his money or his good name. He was terrified that everyone would see him for what he really was. He was scared the world would finally see the monster hidden beneath the expensive suits and public charity. Let him be afraid. Let him feel the same dread she felt that night when he demanded she apologize for his own cheating. The recording came to an end. Charlotte's pained voice, saying sorry for his lie, faded into silence. Judge Peaton spoke. Her voice was level, but you could hear the controlled anger just beneath the surface. "The court will take a 15-minute break." Charlotte stood up from the witness stand. Her legs felt weak, but she held her back straight and her head high. She walked directly past Graham's table on her way to the door. He leaned in and spoke a threat meant only for her. "You will pay for this. I will ruin you." Charlotte paused and looked him straight in the eye, perhaps for the first time in their whole marriage. This was the man she once loved, the man she had trusted completely, the man who had given her a daughter, but had never truly loved either of them. "No," she answered quietly. Her voice was strong and confident. "I really do not think I will." She stepped out of the courtroom, found an empty bench near a window, and sat. She just sat there, taking deep breaths, simply surviving. A woman came over and sat down next to her. Charlotte had never seen her before. She looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair tied back in a ponytail. Her coat was plain and sensible. She looked like a perfectly normal person. "You have no idea who I am," the woman began, "and that is okay, but I needed to say something to you." Charlotte turned to look at her. "I was married to a man like that for 31 years. The woman's voice was steady, but it held a deep, ancient pain. I was never as brave as you. I never once stood up to him. I just survived. Each day, I just made it through. Then one morning, I woke up and realized my whole life had passed me by. She reached over, took Charlotte's hand, and gave it a firm squeeze. What you are doing here is so important, she said. It is not just about you. It is for the rest of us. It is for every woman who was too scared to leave, for every woman who still feels stuck, and for all the ones who will come after us. They will know that someone finally stood up and said no. She squeezed Charlotte's hand one last time. Then she got up, gave a small nod, and walked away. Charlotte never saw the woman again, but she never forgot their conversation. That short moment with a stranger reminded her that this fight was bigger than just her own story. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and went back into the courtroom. There was still more work to do. The 5th day of the trial was the moment everything changed. The courtroom was so crowded that there were no empty seats left. People stood pressed against the walls. Outside, the crowd grew so large that the police had to be called in for crowd control. The tension in the room was so thick you could almost feel it. Bennett rose to his feet. His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. The plaintiff would like to call Deacon Holt to the stand. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Charlotte heard people gasp and saw reporters scribbling frantically in their notepads. She kept her eyes locked on Graham's face. She watched the blood drain from his cheeks, saw his jaw tighten, and saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of the table. All of his fake confidence had vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. He never expected this, and neither did his legal team. Bennett had guarded this secret, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. Now, Graham could only watch as his own father, the man who created the Holt business empire, the man from whom he inherited everything, slowly walked to the witness stand. Deacon used a cane, which tapped on the floor with each step he took. He was thinner and more pale than he used to be, but his piercing blue eyes were as sharp as ever. After taking the oath, he sat down and looked out at the courtroom, knowing that millions of people would hear his words. Finally, his eyes landed on his son. Graham stared back. The father and son were only separated by 20 feet of space and a lifetime of things left unsaid. Graham's face was a storm of anger, betrayal, and something that looked like it could be either sorrow or hatred. Bennett began the questioning. Mr. Holt, could you please tell the court your relationship to the defendant? He is my son. Deacon's voice was weaker than it once was, but it was still perfectly clear. It still had the authority of a man who had controlled boardrooms for decades. I raised him. I taught him all that I know about business and about power. And what exactly did you teach him? Deacon was silent for a moment. The quiet stretched on. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. I taught him that power was the only thing that truly mattered, Deacon finally said. I taught him that money could solve any problem and that showing kindness was a sign of weakness. He took a breath. I was wrong about all of it. Can you tell us about your son's behavior with women? Graham's attorney shot to his feet. Objection. This is not relevant. This is an unfair attack on his character. Bennett responded calmly. It demonstrates a clear pattern of behavior, Your Honor. The plaintiff is arguing there was a history of abuse. This witness has direct knowledge of a documented pattern that goes back many years. Judge Petton considered this. She looked from Bennett to Deacon, and then over to Graham. A small, unreadable expression crossed her face. It almost seemed as if she was pleased by this turn of events. I am going to allow it. The witness may answer the question. Deacon took a deep, shaky breath. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with sadness. It was the sound of a man admitting to sins he had kept secret his whole life. My son treats women like they are property. They are things for him to own, to use, and to discard when he gets tired of them. He paused. I have documentation for at least 14 women he has harmed over the past 20 years. There were cash settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and people who were suddenly fired. It was a pattern anyone could have seen if they had only bothered to look. And you chose not to look? I chose to look the other way. Deacon's voice cracked with emotion. It was just easier that way, and it was better for the company. I told myself it was not my concern. I told myself that Graham's personal life was his own. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Personal life? That is one way of describing it. And what about Charlotte Weston? Was she just another thing for him to own? Yes, I am afraid she was. For the first time, Deacon looked right at Charlotte. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. The Weston family name carried a kind of respect that even all the Holt money could not buy. Her father is a famous judge. Her mother's family is one of the oldest and most respected in all of New York. Graham saw an opportunity. His voice turned to ice. And he took that opportunity the same way he takes everything else, without caring about the people he hurts. He has no empathy and he has no conscience. Do you believe your son ever truly loved Miss Weston? Graham's lawyer was on his feet again to object. The judge sided with him this time, but the damage was done. The question hung in the quiet courtroom, unanswered but understood by everyone. Bennett moved on. Mr. Holt, why did you decide to testify today? Why would you testify against your own son in a public courtroom? Deacon was quiet for a very long time. He looked over at Charlotte and then at the small baby carrier beside her. Eleanor was asleep inside, unaware of the family history being decided around her. Then he looked at his son, his only child, the man who stood to inherit everything he had built. Because I am partly responsible for creating him, Deacon said at last. I raised him to have no empathy, no conscience, and no understanding that other people matter. He never learned that the rules apply to everyone, or that some things simply cannot be bought with money. His voice started to break. I am the one who made this monster, so I must help unmake him. He turned, looking his son Graham straight in the eye. It was a father and son, sharing a gaze where love and pain had curdled into hate. I failed you, Graham. I did not raise you right. I showed you that people were things to be used, that cruelty was strength, and that men like us lived above any laws. Deacon's voice was now barely a whisper, yet his words filled every inch of the silent courtroom. I am sorry. I am so sorry for the man you became. I am sorry for every woman you hurt, because I taught you that women did not matter. But words are not enough. All I can do now is tell the truth, and pray it stops you from hurting anyone ever again. The courtroom was perfectly still. There was not a single cough, a whisper, or any sound at all. Suddenly, Graham leaped to his feet. His face was twisted with pure rage. His voice came out as a low growl. This is ridiculous. He is no longer my father. He is just a sick old man who has been brainwashed by Ms. Holt. Judge Peaton's voice was sharp as ice. You will sit down and you will be silent, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. Is that clear? Graham stood frozen for a moment, trembling with fury. Then his lawyers pulled him back down into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. He sat, but his burning gaze never left his father. Deacon looked back, his expression a mix of sorrow, pity, and maybe a final goodbye. That afternoon, Sienna Cross was called to the witness stand. She looked nothing like the woman Charlotte remembered from the penthouse. She seemed smaller, almost fragile. All of the powerful confidence she used to carry had vanished. In its place was something that looked a lot like fear. She had on a simple gray dress, with no designer labels or expensive jewelry. She looked like someone trying very hard to disappear. Bennett's questions were gentle, but direct. Cross, for how long did you and Graham Holt have an affair? 2 years. Sienna's voice was so faint it was difficult to make out. It started about 6 months before his wedding. Did he promise you that he would leave his wife for you? Sienna hesitated. Her eyes darted to Graham, and then she quickly looked away, as if the sight of him was too much to bear. He told me he just needed to have a child first. He promised that after the baby was born, he would divorce Charlotte and marry me. Were you present on the night Graham forced Charlotte to kneel? The silence in the courtroom stretched on. Sienna's hands were shaking. Yes. Can you please describe for the court what happened? He made her get on her knees and tell me she was sorry. Sienna's voice cracked. It happened in the main hallway of their apartment. She was 8 months pregnant. It was very hard for her to get down on the floor. But he made her do it. And how did you react? The question hung in the air. Sienna's face twisted with shame. I laughed, she whispered. The word dropped into the courtroom like a stone into a still pond. A wave of disgust moved through the room. I laughed, Sienna said again, this time with more force, like a confession to a terrible sin. I thought I had won. I thought it was proof that he loved me more than her. I thought it meant I was better than her. And do you still believe that to be true? Sienna shook her head. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and washing away the mask she had worn for so long. "He was never in love with me," she said. "He has never loved anyone. I was just another object that was useful to him. I was a tool, a weapon to use against his wife. Charlotte was useful to him in the same way. Everyone is useful to Graham, right up until they are not." She then turned to Charlotte. She seemed to be truly seeing her for the first time. "I am sorry. I know that does not fix anything. I know it does not make it right. But I am sorry for all of it." Charlotte felt something shift inside of her. She had hated Sienna for so long. She had imagined this moment countless times, yelling at her, wanting to make her feel the same pain that Charlotte had felt. But sitting there, watching Sienna completely break down on the stand, Charlotte felt something she never expected. Sienna was another one of his victims. It was not the same and it was not as bad, but she had been played too. She was used up and cast aside, like every other person in Graham's life. Graham was the one who did this to both of them. He had turned them into rivals. He made them fight for scraps of his affection while he was secretly laughing at them. He made them hate each other so they would never realize he was the real enemy. Charlotte did not forgive Sienna. She was not sure if she ever could. But she released her hatred, because hate is a heavy thing to carry, and Charlotte was finished carrying a weight that did not belong to her. She looked across the courtroom, met Sienna's eyes, and gave her a single nod. It was a simple acknowledgement, from one woman to another, from one survivor to another. Then she looked away. The prosecution rested its case late in the afternoon. The next day, the judge would give her verdict. The next day, this would all be over. The courtroom was packed far beyond its capacity. People were standing in the hallways, watching the trial on televisions that had been set up for the overflow crowd. For blocks all around the courthouse, news vans lined the streets. Protesters had gathered on both sides of the argument. Their signs and chants created a constant buzz of noise that seeped through the building's thick stone walls. Inside, Charlotte sat at the plaintiff's table. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap. Her face was calm and composed, showing none of the emotion she felt. But, on the inside, her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. After months of fighting, after all the pain, the kneeling, the public humiliation, the frozen assets, the attacks on her name, the testimony, and all the proof, it all came down to this single moment. Eleanor was in a secure room somewhere else in the courthouse with Margot, watched over by Marcus, the security guard. Charlotte had to have her daughter close today, even if Eleanor was too young to understand what was happening. Just knowing she was near gave Charlotte a feeling of strength. The doors opened, and Judge Ruth Peaton walked in. Everyone in the room rose to their feet. The judge appeared as she always did, composed and impossible to read, completely in command. She adjusted the papers in front of her, then looked out at the crowded room. She let the silence hang in the air until it was almost unbearable. Then she spoke. "This court has listened to many hours of testimony over the last 6 days. We have reviewed recordings, documents, and the statements of numerous witnesses. We have considered the arguments from both the plaintiff and the defense. We have heard from family members, from former partners, and from expert witnesses." She paused for a beat. The silence was absolute. The circumstances of this case are quite extraordinary. They are also, unfortunately, not unique. Ruth Peaton turned her head to look directly at Graham. Her gaze was steady and analytical, completely neutral. The defendant, Graham Holt, engaged in an affair with Sienna Cross for approximately 2 years, an affair that began before his marriage to Charlotte Weston. He concealed this relationship through a methodical pattern of deception. He married Miss Weston with the express and documented purpose, found in his own text messages, of producing a child with her and then discarding her. She let the meaning of her words sink in. Most significantly, on the evening of November 14th, Graham Holt forced his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, to kneel on a marble floor before his mistress and apologize for discovering his infidelity. His action was not a mistake made in a moment of passion. It was a cold, calculated act designed to humiliate and control her, to break her spirit until she would obey. The judge then turned to Charlotte. Weston showed remarkable courage by recording his abuse and bringing it into the light. The recording she provided is one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence this court has ever reviewed. She turned her eyes back to Graham. This court has witnessed a clear pattern of emotional abuse, coercive control, and deliberate cruelty that has gone on for many years. Mr. Holt did not simply cheat on his wife. He systematically tried to destroy her sense of self-worth. He used her own body and her pregnancy as tools of control. He coldly planned to dispose of her once she had given him an heir. Graham's lawyers scribbled notes furiously. Graham himself sat like a statue, his face a hard mask of pure anger. Judge Peaton continued, "This court therefore orders the following." She read from her notes, and every word was like a hammer blow to Graham Holt. Full legal and physical custody of Eleanor Charlotte Weston is awarded to her mother. The defendant will be granted supervised visitation only, which requires written approval from the plaintiff and a complete psychological evaluation. Charlotte let out a breath she did not know she was holding. It was the first victory. 70% of all marital assets shall be awarded to the plaintiff. The ruling was a total victory for Charlotte. She was awarded the penthouse, every property from the marriage, and a huge portion of their money. When Graham's attorney tried to rise, a sharp look from Judge Peaton forced him back into his seat. The judge then ordered the defendant to make a public apology. It had to be broadcast on primetime television. During the broadcast, he would have to confess to his abuse, take all the blame, and say he was sorry for his actions on November 14th. The courtroom started whispering. A public apology on national television. Graham Holt was about to admit his guilt to the entire world. But Judge Peaton was not done. "There is one last thing." Her voice grew quiet and serious. "This is a matter the court has weighed very heavily." The entire room fell silent. "Holt, please stand." Graham slowly stood up. He ignored the frantic whispers from his lawyers. He faced the judge, trying to look strong, but Charlotte could see he had no confidence left. Judge Peaton began to speak. "In this room, we heard about an act of exceptional cruelty. On the night of November 14th, you forced your pregnant wife to kneel on marble and apologize for discovering your affair. You did this while your mistress watched and laughed." The judge paused to let her words sink in. This court cannot undo that moment. It cannot erase the shame, the pain, or the emotional damage. It cannot heal the parts of Miss Weston that you shattered that night. She paused once more. But it can restore a sense of balance. It can ensure that you understand publicly the harm you caused to another human being. Graham's calm expression began to crack. His control was slipping. A flicker of sheer terror appeared in his eyes. "Holt," Judge Peaton said, her voice filling the chamber. The courtroom erupted. Graham's lawyers jumped to their feet, shouting objections about precedent and cruel punishment. Judge Peaton simply waited, letting the noise wash over her. She let the attorneys exhaust themselves. Then she raised one hand. The room was instantly quiet. "This is not a punishment," she stated with calm power. "It is an exercise in empathy. You will kneel and apologize, not just to your wife, but to all women who have been diminished by men who believe their money makes them gods. Apologize to every person who has ever been silenced, to every survivor who was made to feel that no one would ever believe them." Graham stood there, frozen. The color drained from his face. His whole body was shaking. "Kneel, Mr. Holt, or I will hold you in contempt of court, and you will serve 60 days in jail." The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2, 5, then 10. Charlotte watched. The entire room watched. Millions of people watching the live stream held their breath. Graham Holt, the billionaire tycoon, the man who forced his pregnant wife to her knees, began to lower himself. It was not a graceful movement. It was the clumsy motion of a person who had never knelt for anyone in his life. He went down, inch by inch, until his knees touched the cold, hard floor. He was kneeling in the center of the courtroom, in front of the cameras, the reporters, and the 12 million people watching worldwide. "Now you will apologize," Judge Peaton commanded. Graham's voice was a choked, broken sound. "I apologize." "Louder," she ordered, "so everyone can hear you." "I apologize." His face was a mix of humiliation, rage, and the shocking new knowledge that his power meant nothing here. None of his money or influence could save him from this moment. Charlotte simply watched him. She had imagined this scene in her mind so many times since that horrible November evening. She had thought about how satisfying it would feel, what a sweet victory it would be to see him brought this low. But, watching Graham on the floor, she felt something completely different. It was not satisfaction. It was not victory. It was not even justice. It was peace. The nightmare was finally, completely, and truly over. He could never hurt her again. He could not control her anymore. He could never again make her feel small or worthless. She was finally free. Judge Ruth Peaton gave a slight nod. "You may stand, Mr." Graham got to his feet. His legs were visibly shaking. He would not look at anyone. For the first time, he looked like what he was, a small, broken man. "This court is adjourned," the judge said. "Miss Weston, I wish you and your daughter the very best. You have shown incredible strength through this ordeal. May your future be bright." Charlotte stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." She left the courtroom, walking past Graham, who still avoided her eyes, and past the crowd of cameras and journalists. Harper was waiting outside for her. Margot was there too, holding Eleanor. The baby was awake, her big blue eyes taking in the commotion with innocent curiosity. Charlotte took her daughter in her arms and held her close, inhaling her sweet baby smell. "It is all done, my sweet girl," she whispered. "We did it." Eleanor made a soft cooing sound. Her little hand reached up to touch her mother's cheek. Her smile was pure and bright, full of a future that was now open and safe. Charlotte smiled back, her first real, genuine smile in a very long time. She had fought a terrible battle. She had endured. She had survived. And now she could finally begin to live. 3 months later, Charlotte sat on the terrace of her Manhattan penthouse, which now belonged only to her. The city lights twinkled below, like a million stories waiting to be told. Eleanor was sleeping in her crib. The baby monitor on the table transmitted the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. The verdict had changed everything. Graham's public apology aired 3 weeks after the trial. It was a 32-minute broadcast on every major network during prime time. It showed Graham at a desk, reading a statement with a pale, exhausted face and a lifeless voice. 93 million people watched it live. Many more saw the clips online. The internet memes were merciless. There were images of Graham kneeling in the courtroom. There were videos of his forced apology. He became a national joke, a poster child for a powerful man getting his just desserts. His own board of directors removed him as chief executive officer just 2 weeks after the ruling. The company his own father founded now wanted nothing to do with him. He was a disgrace and a liability. His story turned into a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Sienna went to Europe the day after the trial. Charlotte heard she was in Paris, then Milan, then somewhere in Switzerland. She never called or sent any message. Charlotte did not know where Sienna was, and she did not care. That chapter of her life was closed. 14 other women came forward after the verdict. These were 14 women Graham had victimized over the years. They were 14 women who had signed secrecy agreements and taken money to be quiet because they were afraid no one would help them. But now they were speaking out, and now people were finally listening. Graham was facing a huge number of lawsuits that would keep his lawyers busy for a very long time. The financial damages from those cases alone would likely wipe out what little he had left. Charlotte took no joy in his downfall, but she did not feel sorry for him either. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. Deacon died 6 weeks after his testimony. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at a nursing home in Connecticut. Charlotte sent flowers to the funeral, but did not attend. She had already found peace with him in the diner, on the day he gave her the flash drive and his word. She had honored his final wish. His foundation for abuse survivors was thriving, and Charlotte served on the board. She helped design programs for women escaping men like Graham, giving them the tools they needed to build new lives. But it never felt like enough. It could not undo all the damage he had done. But it was a start, a small source of hope. A magazine article about her story won a prestigious award. It was called The Acquisition: How Billionaire Graham Holt Turned Marriage into a Weapon. The story detailed her experience, along with the stories of the 14 other women. It exposed the entire system that allowed men like Graham to operate without consequences. Charlotte read it only once. Then she put it away. The past was in the past, and she was focused on what was ahead. Harper visited her every week. They would sit on the terrace, drinking wine or tea. They talked about normal things, like books and television. They shared a laugh about a troublesome patron at the library. It was the simple, ordinary part of life, and it felt wonderful. Her mother had stayed at the penthouse for a while after the trial. She helped with Eleanor and made sure Charlotte was okay. But Margot returned to her own house last month. Standing at the door with her suitcase, she said, "You are going to be just fine on your own. You have a strength that you never knew you had, and Eleanor is so lucky to have you as her mother." Charlotte embraced her for a long time. For just a moment, she felt like a child again, perfectly safe. "Thank you," she whispered, "for always being on my side, for believing in me, and for having that lawyer's number ready." Margot smiled, kissed her on the forehead, and walked out into the bright afternoon. Charlotte sat alone on the terrace, thinking about everything. She remembered the naive young woman she had been, the one who believed that love could solve any problem. She was a different person now, stronger and wiser, and she knew that love was never enough on its own. A person also had to be brave enough to fight for themselves. Her fingers found their way to her phone, locking and unlocking the screen. It was a nervous habit she picked up during her difficult years with Graham. Back then, she would stare at it, waiting for him to approve of her. She caught herself, offered a small smile, and set the phone aside. She did not need his permission anymore. She did not need it from anyone. She finally knew her own worth. The next morning, Margot came over for coffee. They chatted while Eleanor played on a blanket, happily chewing a toy. The baby was almost 11 months old. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's strong-willed chin. She was a gorgeous baby. "You are different now," Margot said quietly. It was an observation, not a question. Charlotte considered it for a second. "I am. What does that feel like?" She watched Eleanor reach for a bright toy. "I used to think being strong meant you never fell apart," she began. "It meant forcing a smile when you were hurting and pretending everything was fine. But I see now that is not strength. That is just survival. Real strength is something totally different." Charlotte looked at her mother, a woman who had raised a child alone, battled her own demons, and built a new life from ash. "True strength is letting yourself completely break," Charlotte continued. "It is about feeling every ounce of the pain. Afterward, you pick up the shattered pieces and build something new." She smiled warmly, adding, "And you learn to accept that you are not the same person you were before." Tears welled up in Margot's eyes as she squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your grandmother would have been incredibly proud." "I know she would," Charlotte whispered. "And for the first time, I am proud of myself too." 1 year later, Charlotte stood on a stage in a massive hotel ballroom. 500 people looked up at her from their seats. The crowd was a mix of survivors, allies, and members of the press. They had traveled from every corner of the country to attend the conference. These were people who knew her struggle because they had lived their own. Charlotte had been invited to be the keynote speaker, but she initially said no. She was still terrified of public speaking. Sharing her story felt like ripping open a wound that had just closed. Then she remembered the woman she met at the courthouse. That stranger told her that her fight mattered and wished she had found the same courage. If her story could empower just one person, she had to face her fear. "He forced me to my knees when I was 8 months pregnant." A hush fell over the entire room. You could hear a pin drop. "My husband made me kneel and apologize to his mistress. He did it to show me he had absolute control. He needed me to feel like an object he owned." Charlotte paused, letting the weight of the memory settle in the air. She allowed herself to truly feel that humiliation one last time. "I stayed on that floor because I did not think I had another option. It never occurred to me that I could fight back. I had no idea my own voice had any power. I did not know the power of the truth." She looked out and saw tears, fury, and hope reflected in the faces before her. She knew they understood completely. "I know now that standing up is always a choice. You can find the strength even when you are shaking with fear. You can find it when the world is telling you to stay quiet and just accept your fate." Her voice gained a new power. You have permission to make a scene. You have permission to be loud and to take up space. You deserve respect, and you deserve a love that does not bring you pain. She pictured Eleanor, her little 2-year-old daughter. That little girl was going to grow up in a much different world. She would be raised seeing that women have the power to resist. She would understand that the truth is vital and that justice is possible. "We stand up," Charlotte announced, "not because it is the easy thing to do. We do it because it is the only way forward. We do it for our daughters and for all the women before us who never had the chance. We rise because we are worth so much more. We are better than what they did to us." She stopped and smiled. "So please, stand up. Use your voice. And whenever someone tries to silence you or make you feel small, I want you to remember this. You are not alone. You are never, ever alone. And you are so much stronger than you can possibly imagine." A single person started clapping, and then another joined in. In moments, the applause was like rolling thunder, a powerful wave of support that washed over her. She stepped back from the podium. Her heart was racing, and her eyes were misty with tears, but she was smiling from ear to ear. She had actually done it. She had told her story. She had finally let her voice be heard. She knew without a doubt that someone in that crowd desperately needed to hear those words. Someone who was exactly where she had been 3 years before. That night, Charlotte came home. She paid the babysitter and went to peek in on Eleanor. Her daughter was fast asleep, cuddled up with all of her stuffed animals. She sat on the edge of the bed, just watching the gentle rise and fall of her daughter's chest. Her little hand clutched her favorite stuffed elephant. "You will never get on your knees for anyone," she whispered softly. "Do you hear me, Eleanor Charlotte Weston? Not for any person, for any reason, not ever." Eleanor stirred just a little in her sleep and smiled, as if she understood every word. Charlotte gently kissed her daughter's forehead. Then she walked to the window. The lights of Manhattan twinkled far below. This was the city where her entire world had fallen apart. And it was the exact same city where she had carefully built it back up again. She thought briefly about Graham. She had heard he was living in a much smaller house somewhere in the Hamptons. He was keeping a low profile while battling a number of lawsuits. She realized with a start that she felt no hatred for him. But she did not feel any love either. She felt a complete and total nothingness toward him. That part of her life was finished, like closing the cover on a book. He was a character in her past, but he had no place in her future. She still had the recording he made on her phone. She would listen to it late at night, not to relive the pain, but to remind herself of how profoundly she had changed and how far she had traveled. From a woman brought to her knees to a woman who now stands tall. From a wife who was made to feel sorry for her own life to a mother who demanded a better one. From being silenced to discovering her voice. From existing in fear to welcoming her freedom. From being broken into for pieces to becoming whole again. Charlotte left the window, walked to her bedroom, changed into her pajamas, brushed her teeth and washed her face. She climbed into bed, pulled the covers up to her chin and shut her eyes. The city hummed quietly outside her building. The baby monitor crackled softly with the sound of Eleanor's breathing. The apartment was peaceful and safe, filled with the gentle rhythm of a new life. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own victories, and its own opportunities to grow even stronger. Her story was not over. It was really just beginning. But on this night, Charlotte Weston slept a deep, restful sleep, completely free of dreams. The nightmares had finally left her for good, and the rest of her amazing life was waiting for her. And that was the story of Charlotte Weston, a woman who chose to never kneel again. If this story made you feel something, if it stirred your anger, or if it gave you a sense of hope, then I would like to ask you to do one small thing. Please hit that like button. It helps more than you could ever know. Please leave a comment for me below. Tell me what part of this story resonated with you the most. Share this story with anyone who might need a reminder that they always have the power to stand up. And if you have not subscribed yet, please come and join our family. We share stories that have real meaning. Until the next time, stay strong and never let anyone make you bow.